What if the occult symbols your neighbors carved into their basement floor weren't just theatrical props for weekend roleplay, but a genuine summons that something ancient actually answered? Before we descend into the most disturbing case of ritual murder in Pacific Northwest history, drop a comment below and tell us from where you are watching. Have you ever walked past a house and felt an inexplicable dread, sensed that the people inside were worshiping something that was listening, or realized too late that the spiritual group you joined was opening doors that should remain forever sealed? Keep that feeling close, because today we're traveling to Ashwood, Oregon, where 17 people vanished over 14 months, where a charismatic leader convinced his followers that an entity called Baphomet could grant them power beyond imagination, and where investigators discovered that some ancient things are still waiting in the darkness for believers devoted enough to call their names. It's November 2018 in Ashwood, Oregon, a timber town of 8,000 souls, nestled in the Cascade foothills approximately 90 miles southeast of Portland, surrounded by dense forests of Douglas fir and western hemlock that press against the town's borders like they're trying to reclaim land humans temporarily borrowed. Ashwood is the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where the same families have worked the same jobs for generations, where the most exciting annual event is the Timber Festival each June that brings modest tourist dollars and temporary life to the aging Main Street. But by November 2018, Ashwood had transformed into something else entirely. In the span of just 14 months, 17 people had vanished without explanation, without witnesses, without the kind of evidence that usually accompanies disappearances. No abandoned vehicles with keys still in the ignition. No trails of credit card purchases leading away from town. No final text messages or social media posts hinting at plans to leave. Just people who existed one day and ceased to exist the next, leaving behind jobs, families, mortgages, and lives they showed no previous indication of wanting to abandon. The disappearances followed no obvious pattern that made sense to investigators. The missing ranged in age from 19 to 54. They included men and women in roughly equal numbers. Some were lifelong Ashwood residents whose families had lived in the area for 4 generations. Others were relative newcomers who had moved to town within the past 5 years, drawn by cheap real estate and the promise of simpler lives away from urban chaos. They worked different jobs, belonged to different social circles, attended different churches or no churches at all. What united them, what became increasingly clear as bodies failed to surface and leads evaporated into dead ends, was the absolute terror their absence created in the people left behind. Ashwood transformed from a quiet town where people rarely locked doors into a community paralyzed by fear, where parents wouldn't let children walk to school alone, where businesses closed before sunset, where gun sales tripled at the local sporting goods store and the hardware store sold out of deadbolts and security cameras within weeks of the 3rd disappearance. The Ashwood Police Department, consisting of Chief Robert Martinez and 4 officers accustomed to dealing with occasional drunk driving arrests, domestic disputes, and teenage vandalism, found themselves completely overwhelmed. They called in the Oregon State Police. They requested assistance from the FBI. Specialized units trained in serial crimes and missing persons cases descended on Ashwood with their expertise and resources and advanced technology. All of them left weeks later with nothing but frustration and the growing suspicion that something fundamentally wrong was happening in this town, something that didn't follow the rules that usually governed even the most disturbing criminal cases. The first disappearance occurred on September 12, 2017, and at the time it seemed tragic but explainable. Marcus Webb, a 32-year-old logging equipment mechanic known throughout Ashwood for his skill with complex machinery and his willingness to help neighbors with repair projects free of charge, simply didn't show up for work one Monday morning. His supervisor, accustomed to Marcus's reliability, called his house repeatedly throughout the morning, growing more concerned with each call that went to voicemail. By early afternoon, the supervisor drove to Marcus's rental house on the east side of town and found Marcus's truck parked in the driveway, his wallet and keys sitting on the kitchen counter, his work boots by the door. The house showed no signs of disturbance, no indication of struggle or forced entry, nothing that suggested anything worse than a man who had perhaps gone for an unexpected walk in the surrounding forest. But Marcus Webb never came back. Search parties scoured the woods surrounding Ashwood for days. They found nothing, not a piece of torn clothing caught on branches, not a single footprint leading away from his house, not even scent trails that the search dogs could follow beyond a certain point about half a mile from Marcus's back door, where the animals would suddenly stop, whine, and refuse to continue no matter how much their handlers urged them forward. The second disappearance occurred 3 weeks later. Sarah Chen, a 24-year-old elementary school teacher new to Ashwood, failed to show up for her Tuesday morning class. Her principal, worried because Sarah had never missed a day without calling, went to her apartment and found her car in the parking lot, her door unlocked, her coffee maker still on, with a full pot of burned coffee that had been sitting on the heating element for hours. Sarah's purse sat on her kitchen table. Her phone was plugged in and charging beside her bed. Her shoes were lined up neatly by the front door. But Sarah Chen was gone, vanished sometime between Sunday evening when neighbors heard her television through the shared wall and Tuesday morning when her absence was finally noticed. The pattern continued with horrifying regularity. Every 2 to 3 weeks another person would disappear. The victims seemed random. A 61-year-old retired postal worker, a 19-year-old community college student home for the weekend, a 47-year-old nurse, a 35-year-old carpenter. There was no obvious connection between them, no shared workplace or social circle or routine that investigators could identify. But there was something the police didn't know, something that wouldn't become clear until much later when all the pieces finally came together in the most disturbing way possible. Every single person who vanished had attended at least one meeting of a group that called itself the Cascade Enlightenment Circle. The group had formed in early 2016, shortly after a man named David Marsh moved to Ashwood from Seattle. David was 43 years old, charismatic in that particular way that draws people seeking meaning in their lives, educated enough to sound credible when discussing philosophy and spirituality, but not so academic that he alienated working-class people. He had a background in software development, money saved from the tech boom, and claimed he had moved to Ashwood specifically to escape the spiritual emptiness of modern urban life and create a community dedicated to exploring ancient wisdom traditions. David rented a large house on Willow Street, a 2-story craftsman-style home built in the 1920s with a partial basement that he immediately began renovating. He told neighbors he was creating a meditation space, a quiet room for spiritual practice away from the distractions of the modern world. The renovation took months, with David doing most of the work himself, bringing in only occasional help from local contractors for electrical work and plumbing. Neighbors noted that David seemed obsessed with the basement, spending hours down there each day, often working late into the night when strange sounds would drift up through the floorboards. The Cascade Enlightenment Circle began meeting in David's basement in March 2016. The initial gatherings were small, just 5 or 6 people drawn by flyers David had posted at the local library, coffee shop, and community center. The flyers promised meditation instruction, discussions of philosophy and spirituality, and a supportive community for those seeking deeper meaning beyond conventional religion. Nothing about them seemed threatening or unusual. Ashwood had seen similar groups come and go over the years, people searching for connection and purpose in an increasingly disconnected world. The early meetings focused on basic meditation techniques, discussions of Eastern philosophy mixed with elements of Western esoteric traditions, and group exercises designed to build trust and openness among participants. People who attended these initial gatherings later reported that David was an engaging teacher, knowledgeable and patient, creating an atmosphere that felt safe and welcoming. Several attendees brought friends and family members to subsequent meetings. By June 2016, the group had grown to approximately 20 regular participants. It was around this time that David began introducing more specific teachings, moving beyond general spirituality into something more focused and structured. He spoke about Baphomet, describing the entity not as the demonic figure of Christian mythology, but as an ancient symbol of balance, wisdom, and hidden knowledge. Baphomet, David explained, represented the union of opposites, the reconciliation of spirit and matter, masculine and feminine, light and darkness. The figure that had been demonized by the medieval church was actually a gateway to profound understanding, a key that could unlock human potential that had been suppressed for centuries by organized religion's need to control the masses. The teachings resonated with people who felt alienated from conventional spirituality, who were searching for something that felt more authentic and powerful than the churches they had attended as children or the shallow New Age practices that promised transformation but delivered only empty platitudes. David presented Baphomet as a teacher, a guide that could help sincere seekers access knowledge that had been deliberately hidden from humanity. By August 2016, the meetings had evolved significantly. David introduced ritual practices, structured ceremonies that he claimed were based on ancient traditions preserved in obscure texts and passed down through secretive lineages. The rituals involved candles, incense, chanting in languages that sounded vaguely Latin but weren't quite identifiable, and meditation focused on invoking the presence of Baphomet. Participants were encouraged to visualize the traditional image of Baphomet, the goat-headed figure with bat wings and a torch between its horns, and to open themselves to communication with this ancient consciousness. Some participants felt uncomfortable with this direction and quietly stopped attending. Others, approximately 15 core members, became increasingly devoted, attending meetings twice weekly and speaking enthusiastically about the profound experiences they were having during the rituals. They reported visions during meditation, feelings of presence in the room, moments of clarity and insight that seemed to come from outside their own minds. David began teaching that Baphomet could grant specific abilities to those who proved their devotion. Enhanced intuition, the ability to influence others through force of will, access to hidden knowledge about past and future, protection from harm. And for those who achieved the deepest level of connection, immortality itself. Not metaphorical spiritual immortality, but actual physical transcendence of death, transformation into something beyond ordinary human limitation. These teachings attracted a particular type of person, not necessarily unstable or gullible people, but individuals who were at vulnerable points in their lives. People facing terminal illness diagnoses, people struggling with financial ruin or devastating losses, people who felt powerless in a world that seemed increasingly chaotic and threatening. David offered them hope, purpose, and the promise of genuine power in a reality where they felt they had none. By January 2017, the core group had become intensely insular. Members spent most of their free time either at meetings or studying materials David provided, obscure texts he claimed to have translated from rare sources. They began distancing themselves from family members who questioned their involvement. Several quit their jobs, explaining that they were preparing for a transition to a new way of living that would make conventional employment unnecessary. The basement where they met had been transformed into something that no longer resembled a simple meditation space. David had painted elaborate symbols on the concrete floor, intricate geometric patterns that seemed to shift and move in the candlelight. The symbols incorporated elements from multiple esoteric traditions, Kabbalistic diagrams, alchemical symbols, sigils from grimoires, and other markings that didn't correspond to any recognized system. At the center of the floor was a large depiction of Baphomet rendered in remarkable detail with paint that seemed to have a faintly luminescent quality in darkness. The rituals grew more intense and demanding. David introduced blood sacrifice, starting with small animals. Chickens at first, then rabbits, then larger creatures. He explained that blood was a source of life force energy, that offering it to Baphomet was necessary to strengthen the connection between their world and the realm where this ancient consciousness resided. Some participants objected, expressing discomfort with killing animals. David responded that their squeamishness was a product of weakness instilled by a society that wanted to keep people docile and powerless. Those who couldn't transcend such limitations weren't ready for the knowledge Baphomet offered. 3 more people left the group after the animal sacrifices began. That left 12 devoted core members who attended every ritual and accepted everything David taught without question. These 12 became David's true congregation, his inner circle, completely committed to the path he was leading them down. It was in August 2017, 1 month before Marcus Webb disappeared, that David announced the group was ready for the next stage. They'd been preparing for over a year, building their connection to Baphomet through meditation, ritual, and sacrifice. Now it was time to open the full gateway, to bring Baphomet completely through from its realm into theirs. This would require a greater offering, something more significant than animal blood. David explained that human consciousness was the most potent energy source in existence. A willing human sacrifice, someone who consciously chose to give their life force to open the gateway, would create enough power to complete the connection. And the person who made this ultimate offering would be transformed, becoming the first to achieve the immortality Baphomet promised. They wouldn't truly die, but would be reborn as something greater, the first of a new type of being that would inherit the earth as the old humanity faded away. The group spent weeks discussing who among them would have the honor of being first. It was presented as an honor, a privilege, the chance to be a pioneer in humanity's next evolutionary step. Several members volunteered, but David insisted that Baphomet itself would choose the proper candidate, that signs would appear indicating who was meant to take this sacred role. Marcus Webb, though not part of David's inner circle, had attended 2 meetings of the Cascade Enlightenment Circle in July 2017, brought by his girlfriend, who was one of the devoted 12. Marcus had been skeptical but curious, interested in meditation but uncomfortable with the darker elements David introduced. He had stopped attending after the second meeting, telling his girlfriend that something about the group felt wrong to him, that David Marsh seemed less like a spiritual teacher and more like someone who enjoyed having power over others. Marcus's girlfriend, a 29-year-old woman named Rachel Torres, was deeply embedded in the group. She tried repeatedly to convince Marcus to return, to give David a genuine chance, to open his mind to possibilities beyond his limited rational understanding. Marcus refused, and their relationship became strained. By late August, they had broken up, with Rachel choosing her commitment to the circle over her relationship with Marcus. On September 10, 2017, 2 days before Marcus disappeared, Rachel mentioned him during a ritual. She expressed frustration that Marcus couldn't see the truth she had found, that he was trapped in conventional thinking and missing an opportunity for transformation. David, in what seemed like casual conversation after the ritual, asked Rachel questions about Marcus. Where he lived, what his routine was, whether he lived alone. Rachel answered without thinking, now realizing she was providing targeting information. That night, David had a private meeting with 3 of the most devoted male members of the group. He told them that Baphomet had shown him a vision, had identified Marcus Webb as the first offering. Marcus had been brought to the edge of enlightenment but had turned away, rejecting the gift he was offered. This rejection created a debt, an energetic imbalance that needed to be corrected. By taking Marcus, whether he came willingly or not, they would not only open the gateway but also restore balance that Marcus had disturbed by walking away. The 3 men, so deep in their devotion that they no longer questioned anything David said, agreed to help. On the night of September 11th, they went to Marcus Webb's house. Marcus was asleep. They broke in quietly, using techniques David had taught them for moving in silence. They drugged Marcus with chloroform, carried him to a van parked a block away, and brought him to David's basement. Marcus regained consciousness to find himself lying on the painted floor in the center of the Baphomet symbol, his hands and feet bound, the 12 members of the inner circle standing in a ring around him, candles casting their flickering shadows on the concrete walls. David stood at Marcus's head, wearing a robe covered in symbols, holding a knife that gleamed in the dim light. Marcus tried to speak, to plead, to demand explanation, but his mouth was gagged. He could only make muffled sounds as terror overwhelmed him, and he pulled frantically at the ropes binding his limbs. David began chanting in that strange pseudo-Latin language, the other members joining in, their voices rising and falling in rhythms that seemed designed to bypass rational thought and access something deeper and more primal. The ritual lasted for hours. David cut Marcus multiple times, small, precise cuts that bled but didn't kill, collecting the blood in a silver bowl and pouring it onto the painted symbols on the floor. The blood seemed to be absorbed immediately, disappearing into the concrete as if the floor itself were drinking it. Marcus's muffled screams gradually weakened as blood loss and shock took their toll. Around 3 in the morning, David plunged the knife into Marcus's chest, piercing his heart. Marcus convulsed once, twice, then went still. 12 people watched him die, watched his eyes glaze over and the life drain from his body. And then they waited, expecting transformation, expecting Marcus to rise changed and eternal as David had promised. But nothing happened. Marcus remained dead, his body cooling on the concrete floor, blood pooling around him. The room was silent except for the nervous breathing of the congregation and the occasional drip of melting wax from the candles. David, after several long minutes, told the group not to worry. The transformation happened on a spiritual level first. Marcus's consciousness had passed through the gateway. His body would catch up later. They needed to properly dispose of the physical remains and continue with their work. Baphomet required more offerings before the gateway would open fully. One sacrifice wasn't enough. They needed to build momentum, to accumulate enough life force energy that the barrier between worlds would finally shatter completely. The group wrapped Marcus's body in plastic sheeting and carried it out to David's van in the pre-dawn darkness. They drove deep into the Cascade National Forest, to an area David had scouted previously, a ravine with steep sides and dense vegetation where hikers rarely ventured. They buried Marcus in a grave 6 feet deep, covering him with rocks and deadfall to discourage animals from digging. Then they returned to Ashwood and cleaned the basement meticulously, removing every trace of blood, washing the floor until the symbols shone clean and bright again. 3 weeks later, they took Sarah Chen, the elementary school teacher. She had attended one circle meeting out of curiosity, brought by a coworker who was part of the congregation. Sarah had been polite but uninterested, thanking them for their time but explaining that this particular path wasn't for her. David identified her as the second offering. The pattern was established. They would target people who had touched the edges of their group but hadn't committed, people whose rejection of the offered enlightenment created that energetic debt David spoke of so convincingly. By November 2018, they had taken 17 people. The rituals followed the same pattern each time. Abduction during the night. Hours of chanting and symbolic cutting. The final knife thrust to the heart. The disappointed wait for transformation that never came. The burial in various locations across thousands of acres of dense forest where bodies might never be found. The congregation never questioned what they were doing. David's explanations for why the transformation hadn't manifested yet became increasingly elaborate, increasingly divorced from reality. But his devoted followers accepted them without doubt. They were too invested, had gone too far, had done things that could never be undone. Questioning David now would mean confronting what they had become, acknowledging that they had murdered 17 innocent people for nothing. It was psychologically easier to continue believing, to maintain faith that the next sacrifice would be the one that finally opened the gateway and justified everything they had done. But by late November 2018, cracks were beginning to show. Rachel Torres, who had provided the information that led to Marcus Webb's death, was having severe psychological problems. She couldn't sleep. When she did manage to sleep, nightmares of Marcus's face haunted her, his eyes accusing, his muffled screams echoing in her mind. She began missing rituals, making excuses about being sick. David grew concerned that Rachel was becoming a liability, that her guilt might drive her to confession. On November the 24th, 2018, everything fell apart in a way no one could have anticipated. The breakthrough in the case came from an unexpected source. Jennifer Walsh, a retired forensic psychologist who had moved to Ashwood 6 months earlier, had been volunteering with the search efforts for missing persons. Jennifer had worked for the FBI for 25 years before retiring, specializing in cult behavior and mass psychology. Something about the disappearances bothered her, a pattern she couldn't quite articulate but that her experienced instincts recognized. Jennifer began conducting informal interviews with family members of the missing, asking questions that went beyond the standard police inquiries. She wanted to know about the victims' social connections, their interests, any groups or organizations they might have been involved with, even briefly. It was during one of these conversations that she heard about the Cascade Enlightenment Circle for the first time. The mother of Sarah Chen mentioned that Sarah had attended one meeting of some meditation group, though she couldn't remember the name. Jennifer's interest was immediately piqued. She began asking other families whether their missing loved ones had any connection to meditation groups or spiritual organizations. 3 more families mentioned the circle. That was enough. Jennifer brought her findings to Chief Martinez, who had been so desperate for leads that he was willing to investigate even the most tenuous connections. On November 23rd, Martinez obtained a warrant to search David Marsh's property. The warrant was based on thin grounds, just the fact that multiple missing persons had attended meetings there, but a sympathetic judge who was growing increasingly alarmed by Ashwood's crisis approved it. Martinez, 2 of his officers, and Jennifer Walsh arrived at David's house at 6 in the morning, expecting perhaps to find some evidence of drug use or other illegal activity that might be tangentially connected to the disappearances. What they found in the basement was beyond anything they could have imagined. The symbols painted on the floor were immediately disturbing, clearly the work of someone deep in occult practice. But it was the stains that made Jennifer's blood run cold. Despite extensive cleaning, luminol revealed massive amounts of blood residue soaked into the concrete, blood that had been there repeatedly, creating layers of overlapping stains. There were also implements, knives with ornate handles, silver bowls with dark residue, candles marked with strange symbols, and a collection of clothing items that would later be identified as belonging to several of the missing victims. David Marsh was arrested immediately. The 12 members of his inner circle were identified through documents found in the house and brought in for questioning. And over the next 72 hours, as investigators applied pressure and as the congregation members were separated from David's influence for the first time in months, the entire horrifying story emerged. Rachel Torres broke first. The guilt she had been suppressing overwhelmed her, and she confessed everything, her voice flat and emotionless as she described 17 murders in clinical detail. Her confession led to the arrest of the others. Some maintained their faith in David even after arrest, insisting that the police simply didn't understand, that they were interrupting something sacred. But most, once removed from the basement and the rituals and David's constant reinforcement, began to realize what they had done. The search for bodies began immediately. Rachel and others provided approximate locations where victims had been buried. Recovery teams spent weeks combing through the forests, finding one grave after another. By mid-December 2018, 16 bodies had been recovered. Only one, the 19-year-old college student, remained missing, buried in a location none of the congregation members could precisely recall. David Marsh maintained his innocence in a way that chilled investigators. He didn't deny the murders, but he insisted they weren't crimes. They were sacred acts, necessary sacrifices to open a gateway that would transform humanity. He spoke with absolute conviction about Baphomet, describing conversations he claimed to have had with this entity, visions it had shown him of a future where death was obsolete and human consciousness could expand beyond the limitations of flesh. Psychological evaluations determined he was not legally insane. He understood that what he did was illegal. He simply believed the laws were wrong, created by a society trapped in ignorance. The trial began in May 2019 and lasted for 3 months. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of premeditation, coordination, and extreme cruelty. The defense attempted to argue that David's followers, not David himself, had committed the murders. That he was simply a spiritual teacher whose message had been misinterpreted by unstable individuals. But testimony from the congregation members made it clear that David had orchestrated everything, had specifically identified each victim, had provided the tools and instructions, had been present at every murder. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. David Marsh was found guilty on 17 counts of first-degree murder. Oregon had abolished the death penalty, so he received 17 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole. The 12 members of the congregation received varying sentences based on their levels of involvement, ranging from 15 years to life. But the convictions didn't bring closure to Ashwood. The town was shattered by revelations that ordinary neighbors had been involved in ritual murder, that 17 people had been killed in a basement less than 2 blocks from the elementary school, that a group of people had been meeting twice weekly for over a year, worshiping something called Baphomet and planning murders, while the rest of town went about their normal lives completely unaware. Trust evaporated. Families who had lived in Ashwood for generations began moving away, unable to remain in a place marked by such profound evil. Businesses closed. Property values plummeted. The house on Willow Street was condemned and eventually demolished, the basement filled with concrete after multiple exorcisms performed by concerned clergy. But even after the physical structure was gone, people avoided that property, crossed the street rather than walk past the empty lot. Jennifer Walsh, the forensic psychologist whose instincts had cracked the case, spent months after the trial studying David Marsh and trying to understand how an educated man with no previous criminal record had transformed into a serial killer who convinced others to help him murder. Her conclusion was disturbing. David had genuinely believed, at least initially, that he was accessing something real. He had studied occult texts, practiced rituals, convinced himself through years of solitary practice that he was in contact with an ancient entity. But something had gone wrong. Whether through mental illness triggered by his obsessive practices or through genuine contact with something that wasn't what he believed it to be, David had become convinced that human sacrifice was necessary. And once he committed that first murder, once he crossed that ultimate line, he became psychologically trapped. To admit he was wrong would mean facing the full horror of what he had done. So instead, he doubled down, created increasingly elaborate justifications, pulled others into his delusion until he had a congregation united in murder. The most disturbing question remained unanswered. During the investigation, researchers examining the symbols David had painted on his basement floor discovered something that sent chills through everyone who saw the analysis. The symbols, which appeared to be David's own creation, mixing elements from multiple traditions, matched with over 90% accuracy. a set of diagrams found in an extremely obscure 15th century grimoire housed in a private collection in France. David Marsh had never traveled to France. He had never seen this grimoire. The text had never been photographed or digitized. It existed in only one copy, and access to it was severely restricted. There was no rational way David could have known about these specific symbols, much less reproduce them with such precision. When confronted with this during his final interview before sentencing, David smiled for the first time since his arrest. He said that Baphomet had shown him that during his deepest meditations he had been given visions of ancient texts, of symbols that predated human civilization, of knowledge that existed before the first humans walked the earth. The symbols didn't come from any book. They came from the source, from Baphomet itself. The interviewer pressed him. Did he still believe, even after everything, even facing life in prison? David's smile never faltered. He said that belief wasn't the right word. He knew. He had spoken with something during those rituals. Something had answered when he called. The mistake was thinking it was Baphomet, thinking it was a teacher that wanted to elevate humanity. It was something older and darker, something that fed on suffering and blood, something that had been waiting for centuries for someone foolish enough to open a door. The 17 people hadn't died to open a gateway to enlightenment. They had died to feed something that should never have been contacted in the first place. And now that it had been fed, now that it had tasted modern blood and modern consciousness, it would be waiting. Patient. Eternal. For the next person who thought they were wise enough to call upon ancient powers and control what answered. Today, David Marsh sits in Oregon State Penitentiary, spending 23 hours a day in solitary confinement. Guards report that he spends his time writing, covering every inch of paper provided to him with those same symbols that appeared on his basement floor. He refuses to explain what the symbols mean. He simply writes them over and over, filling notebook after notebook. And sometimes, late at night when the prison is quiet, guards walking past his cell report hearing him chanting in that strange pseudo-Latin language, the same chants his congregation once performed in a basement in Ashwood. His voice rising and falling in rhythms that seemed designed to bypass rational thought and access something deeper. Something that might still be listening. The basement on Willow Street is gone, filled with concrete and covered over. But sometimes, residents of Ashwood report strange sounds coming from that empty lot. Chanting that has no visible source. Shadows that move wrong in the darkness. The feeling of being watched by something that remembers what happened there, that was fed there, that might still be hungry. The families of the 17 victims continue their grieving, trying to make sense of senseless deaths, trying to understand how their loved ones became sacrifices to a delusion that convinced a dozen ordinary people to commit murder. There are no good answers. Only the knowledge that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious signs. Sometimes it comes dressed in spiritual language, promising enlightenment and transformation, drawing in vulnerable people searching for meaning and purpose in a world that often seems devoid of both. If you're ever approached by a group promising secret knowledge, ancient wisdom, or powers beyond normal human capability, remember Ashwood. Remember that 17 people died because one charismatic man convinced others that an entity called Baphomet was real and listening. Remember that the desire for transcendence, for meaning, for power over death can be manipulated by those who understand how to exploit human vulnerability. Some doors should remain closed. Some names should not be spoken. And some symbols, no matter how fascinating they might appear, should never be drawn on your floor in the darkness while you wait to see what answers when you call. If this story disturbed you as much as it disturbed us while researching every horrifying detail, please like and subscribe. Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you've ever encountered groups that made promises that seemed too good to be true, that asked you to do things that felt wrong even as they explained why those things were necessary, tell your story. Sometimes keeping these warnings alive is the only way to prevent the next tragedy.